right, so welcome to our fall privacy seminars. I am really excited about our speaker today. Kirsten Martin is our new dean of the Heinz College here. So she is fresh to CMU and super busy doing all the things that deans do. And she is taking time out of her busy deaning schedule to come talk to us about privacy, which is, of course, her true love. Something she's been doing for a long time. In fact, she spoke, I had to look up the year, 2014 in the privacy seminar here about her privacy research. So it is really good to have her back. She's been doing research on the ethics of technology and privacy, looking at corporate responsibilities, lots of really cool work that she's done over the years. A very well-known scholar in the field. She also has spoken to and done some work in support of U.S. government agencies. So she's worked with the Federal Trade Commission and the Census Bureau and the Department of Justice and other agencies both in the U.S. and internationally. She's written a book on ethics of data and analytics. So super interesting work, and I am excited to hear what she has to say today.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I was so excited to be able to go back to doing an old school regular thing, not deaning for like an hour and a half. So I really appreciate the time to talk about privacy. Plus, it's something that I think is really important, and the way that we think about privacy in our everyday studies ends up having huge policy implications. And so this is, I was saying right beforehand, this is kind of a culmination of a number of years where I was working on things, and I would work with some cases, like a Google search case for antitrust case, where they were trying to figure out if Google was, well, they found that they were, but abusing their monopoly by one of the reasons why, or how they were doing that, was by not respecting people's privacy. And you can see this in other areas. And so I was always coming back with, looking at different types of experts on the other side and going to research talks and hearing how people would operationalize privacy. And I realized that a lot of these issues that I was facing were all related. And so I want to talk briefly about today is some of the really common myths and mistakes that we find when we're talking about privacy. And sometimes this is just colloquially when we're talking, and sometimes it comes out in our research and our title. But I want to say that these actually have a lot of meaning when we make these mistakes. So when we see, this is kind of one of the more famous sayings where people say that privacy is dead. But at the same time, when GM sold a bunch of data to an insurance company and people found out about it, they got really upset, and they all of a sudden kind of pulled that practice and stopped doing it. So we say that privacy is dead, but then we see all these issues of Meta being fined, the algorithm disgorgement issues, where we have the FTC actually saying if you gather the data that you're building your model off of, that if it was seen to be a privacy violation or taken without permission, that we all of a sudden can actually make you destroy your models based on that. We also have issues around the Google antitrust cases and the other issues around location data. And so what I would say is it's not that privacy is necessarily dead. So we constantly are saying that no one cares about privacy, we being just generally within headlines, or we'll see people will say they don't care about privacy. But when you get down to it, we actually are making great strides in enacting and enforcing privacy issues to make sure people's privacy are being respected, because people actually do care about privacy. So what I want to first talk about is there are these three common myths that I'll end up getting to, but what I'm going to say is that they're all connected to a really simple mistake, which is how we define privacy. So the myths are around that there's some sort of trade-off between functionality and privacy. You hear this all the time, that people have heterogeneous privacy preferences, which is where Lori, Professor Crater, has made great strides in the work of kind of combating that idea. And then also that we act according to the privacy paradox. This is a very common saying, so that whenever people say they care about privacy, experts on the other side will wave it away and say, oh, they're just saying that. When you ask them to do something, they never actually enact it. And then I'll talk briefly about what's happening now. So privacy as concealment, this is the idea of, this is just examples of the privacy paradox and the kind of the prevalence of these types of myths that we have. They're just so common within, is it really not hard? These are all very recent within the last 6 to 8 months. You just see this prevalence of these kind of myths that we talk about around trade-offs and the privacy paradox. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is a privacy mistake, which is the way we define privacy as concealment. And I'm going to say this is a mistake. So privacy as concealment is this idea that privacy is a version of secrecy where as long as you keep the data close to you or you yourself are hidden, you're in a private situation and your privacy is being respected. As soon as you go out in public, you reveal yourself in some way, as soon as you share data with anybody, that then all of a sudden you've given up your privacy, that there's no privacy as that can be respected or expected at that point in time. We sometimes call this secrecy a version of privacy. The key is that, as Helen Niesenbaum says, is that once you reveal yourself or reveal your information, then anything goes around privacy. So there's no privacy interest, you have no right to that privacy. It's unreasonable for you to have any privacy expectations with that data. And so what does this look like? This looks like when I actually I cross this magical dotted line and I reveal myself or I hand things over to a firm, all of a sudden anything goes to what data they collected, what they do with that data, who they share it with. This is the idea that as long as it's concealed, it's private. As soon as we give it up, there's no privacy expectations. However, what we know about privacy, and this is the alternative definition of privacy, is that we regularly share data with expectations and norms around how that data is shared and used, and even what inferences are drawn on about that within a specific context. Meaning that in the educational context, you might have certain data you would expect Carnegie Mellon to actually gather. You would expect them to use it in a certain way, but if they were to use it in a different way, you would become upset. So let's take, for example, they have your GPA. That's totally normal for Carnegie Mellon to have your GPA. And if all of a sudden you went to the University of Pittsburgh for some healthcare, and they were like, I think you actually might need an MRI, but I just looked at your GPA, and it turns out we're not going to give you an MRI right now. And so you would say that is wrong, and who got the data? I didn't want University of Pittsburgh Health Services to get that data. And also how you're using it seems completely not only a privacy violation, but unfair. So we actually care about when we share this data with someone, we actually would say to Carnegie Mellon, you're actually free to use this in any educational way you want. And even if you share it with some other service, as long as it's for an educational purpose, I'm okay with that. And so we have a lot of latitude, we find, when people are sharing data within a specific context. So what this means is that we have these great, we say, well, look, for a certain actor, we call it an actor, a person, an organization, some entity, they're in a context. It's a doctor, it's a salesperson, it's for marketing purposes, it's for retail, it might be for healthcare, for the justice system. There's all sorts of reasons why you share data with a specific person. And you actually, as long as the data is being used for that purpose, whether it's shared with a third party, then we would say that it's, Lisa Baum would call it appropriate flow, but we would say it meets your privacy expectations. There's no privacy violation. So we're actually quite liberal when we ask people this in surveys. People are quite liberal about the amount of data that's collected, as long as it's being used and shared for a specific purpose. So that means that we need to know, so before you say if someone's privacy is violated, you have to know what type of information is gathered, who has access to the information, how it was collected, what data was used and how the data was used, and then what context was it in. So you'd have to kind of know all these parameters, and then you'd be able to say whether or not their privacy was violated. It also means you can violate someone's privacy if any one of those 5 things goes wrong. So it could be that you provided notice and consent, whatever that might mean. So you give some sort of notice, or you don't give notice and consent. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a privacy violation. You could still gather information without notification. So an extreme example might be, I go to the hospital and my husband is with me and they ask my husband questions about my medical information, right? You would think it's completely appropriate for whoever I'm with, whether it's my husband, meaning that he has some sort of special relationship with me, or anyone that was with me that saw what happened, to explain to them, this is what happened to her, this is what I know about her medical issues. They don't need notice or consent from me. It doesn't have to be me that provides that information, as long as it's being used for a medical context. So we actually, just in normal conversations, we have very much more fluid understanding about privacy than this concealment idea. So this is an example of medical context. If all of a sudden the doctor were to take that information and sell it to Amazon and say, Amazon, not only did I diagnose her and treat her with something, this is something they actually looked into doing, so this isn't exactly hypothetical, I'm going to give that data to Amazon in order for Amazon to then kind of target you with advertising because they know that you have a certain medical condition, or if they might kind of say, look, based on the procedure you're about to get, this is what might be helpful to you as you recover at home, right? We would say that's a privacy violation. It's a totally different context of selling me something or advertising. Okay. So this privacy as concealment is problematic because it doesn't really encapsulate that idea that when you hand over data, you retain these expectations of privacy. That's where it goes wrong. And it goes wrong in a couple of different ways. One is it's putting the onus on the person, what Alessandro Acquisti, who used to be here, since left, but hopefully he'll come back, you never know. We used to call the over-responsibilization of the individual, right? So this is the idea that we're putting the onus on the person to deciding, do you reveal or not? Are you giving up your privacy or not? And so it's over-focused on the person as being responsible versus the firm. The second that we need to talk about is defining privacy as this way makes privacy completely unattractive. So we think about privacy as something like trust or love or friendship, as something that's desirable in society and for the individual, meaning when you have trust, society is better off and you yourself are better off, right? Like, so this is it's a goal that we have as a good that is desirable in the world. Like, we should want this thing. If you define privacy as that which is only secret or concealed, it would mean that to retain or attain privacy, you'd have to be in complete isolation. Right? You'd have to be in solitary confinement, never reveal yourself to anyone at any time. That's the only way to stay private. That, by definition, is not desirable, either for society or it's a form of punishment, right? Like, so it's not a normatively desirable goal for us to have. And so in some ways, just by that nature, it doesn't really fit how we operate in the real world. We constantly share information while retaining privacy. But second, it's actually not even desirable to have that definition of privacy. However, I will say it's extremely popular, right? So because we're going to see this over and over again, it's also, I have to say, as we're in an academic setting, extremely easy to measure. So this is why it becomes so popular within academic settings, because if I'm an economist and I'm trying to measure if someone cares about privacy, or if I'm trying to measure whether or not someone gave up privacy, I just have to measure whether they disclose data. And so I take disclosing of data as this indicator, as the operationalization of giving up privacy. And so it's extremely easy in that way. I would say we still should not do this. Disclosure decisions are not privacy decisions, but we tend to conflate the two. And so that's an important thing to know when we're reading studies as to how they operationalize privacy. Okay, so what are these myths? First is that there's a trade-off between functionality and privacy, and we see this all the time. People give up privacy in exchange for fill in the blank. So we see this here where we kind of trade privacy. So this is defining privacy as concealment. They usually don't explicitly say this, but what they say is you gave up your privacy when you gave that data to the company, and in return, you got something back. Sometimes there's famous studies on personalization. So you got personalized services back because you gave up your data. They then kind of say you gave up your privacy. They just make that slip and move over and say you gave up your privacy when you gave up your data. But that's defining privacy as concealment, right? We're just equating the two things together. You see this all the time, personalization versus privacy, digital serfdom, trading privacy for convenience, over and over again, privacy versus banking, trading privacy for convenience, trading privacy for likes. I mean, it's just this constant thing that you see. Both people will tell me this all the time, just if I'm in giving a talk, and they'll be like, yeah, but people trade privacy for a free internet. What they'll say. Or they're trading privacy for convenience, or they're trading privacy for X. And what they mean to say is that when you give over your data, you have expectations as to how it's being used, but they're just seeing that as a flipping of the switches that you all of a sudden are giving up your privacy. Okay. And then also, I would say, in a grander scheme, it actually runs against us because not only do we see this as a trade-off interpersonally, so I'm trading privacy for something else, we, as in like in business schools or economics, we end up making these grand statements that regulating data flows is automatically anti-innovation. So there's this grand trade-off. This is kind of a macro statement that people will make. There's a macro depth idea that if you regulate data, if you stifle data, if you regulate privacy, that all of a sudden innovation will stop. So there's this trade-off between you either get innovation or you get privacy, right? You can't have both together. And I'll just say, like, this is a common and I'll mention this at the end, a common idea within industry as a whole that if you ask them to be regulated, they'll say that their industry cannot survive with that regulation. So this is not novel to big tech to say this. So we used to say this about pollution. If you regulated the steel companies and told them not to dump a bunch of waste in the rivers in Pittsburgh, that the steel companies would die. We used to say this about seatbelts. We've said this about tobacco. We say this, we being United States companies, we say this all the time. So just because they say this doesn't mean we have to listen to them all the time. Okay, so what do they see? So people go online and their data is collected. The service is free and the data allows for improvements or innovation, right? So this is what we see on the outside. All of a sudden, if you define privacy as convenient, as concealment, you then get to say, guess what? When firms collect data, consumers have given up any privacy interests. They cannot be harmed since there are no privacy interests in the data. So firms can do with the data whatever they want. Then you would have like any limitations on data flows by definition means less improvement and less innovation. But all of that is contingent on defining privacy as concealment. So we see the same thing on the outside. People go online and their data is collected. That's true. We see it all the time. The service is free and data allows for improvements and innovation. But what if you don't define it that way? Then you would just say, you would focus on firms' design trade-off. So why do firms design it so that in order to get their service, you have to do whatever, you have to let them do whatever they want with their data. So when companies say, look, I'll either, and we don't do this as much anymore, but I either collect your location data or I don't collect your location data. You have to, it's all or nothing. You don't have any limitation on how it's used or how it's shared. You have no say on it. So if you want to use this mapping app, you have to give me your data and you know nothing how it's going to be used, right? That's a trade-off, but it's not inherent to privacy. You don't have to have that. They could actually design it so that the data is only gathered for the purpose of the app and not actually used outside of the app. That's quite possible. You don't have to use it for those reasons. The main point is that you can look at the same information on the outside, the same fact pattern of seeing data being gathered, innovation happening, and the service is free. And the only reason why we define it as privacy is being given up is because we conveniently just define privacy as concealment. You don't have to define it that way. You can see the same fact pattern and not look at it that way. The same similar one is people have heterogeneous privacy concerns and many are, quote, unconcerned. We see this all the time. So this is the idea that this is an old, and this is going to be so old school for Lori, she's studied this forever, but this is the idea, people will say privacy is dead, people don't care about privacy, or that there's this idea of people being unconcerned. And a lot of this language actually comes back to an idea from just one guy with a couple surveys back in 1967 that kind of looked at and had an idea about how to measure whether or not people cared about privacy. And that's Weston. And so what we say is that when we ask people these series of 3 questions, and it would ask people, do you care about privacy in this general manner? We would say things like, do you think there are enough laws on the books? Do you think that companies actually do trust people with their data? So there's kind of general questions, not specific about, do you want location data to be gathered by your social network site and used for this purpose? That's a very specific question. These are more general kind of, you like to say vibe question, but what we call more generalized questions. And then when people answer them differently, and there's all sorts of issues with that, people just read the questions differently, they understand the questions in different ways. We would say that they're heterogeneous privacy concerns. And in the United States, lo and behold, when we do that, we actually say, well, then the market should decide. So anytime we get to argue that people have heterogeneous preferences or concerns, we get to say the market should decide. That's the way we do it in the United States. And so it's very convenient to say that people have heterogeneous privacy concerns. So you can see this is the actual example of the survey. Most businesses handle personal information they collect in a proper and confidential way. Something about existing laws. People have lost all control. So these are the standard questions that were asked back in the day. And when people asked about or answered them differently, we would say that they had heterogeneous privacy concerns. So the problem with it is that when we ask general questions like that, one of the things that we've done is we would actually tell them what actually was going on. So the 2 questions measured, are there enough laws? And do you think people actually respect your privacy when online? And when a couple of scholars in California actually asked people and told them what laws existed, none. And when people told them what was happening with their data, a lot, they actually asked the same questions again and they answered them totally differently. So the people that were unconcerned suddenly became privacy fundamentalists, right? And so what they was measuring was a lack of information about what they knew was happening online. And so the people don't necessarily have heterogeneous privacy concerns, they just answered these questions differently, and that was just a measure of their knowledge of what they were doing. So what they see is different answers to general survey questions, different answers equals different needs. And so the implications are, you have to leave privacy expectations up to the consumers, let the consumer decide. So this is the whole market approach that we have in the United States of letting the consumer decide. But all this comes from these general statements of saying that people aren't concerned or have heterogeneous concerns. If you think that measuring privacy needs and preferences through specific context-dependent questions, meaning really I'm not gathering anything other than general knowledge when I ask these very general questions, in order to get to the meat of what people want, I actually have to ask very specific questions. And so a great paper, although it wasn't the point of the paper, was you with Alessandro and a few others. I can't remember who else was on it. It was just a few years ago. And you guys, they asked a series of questions that were more general questions and then mapped it onto specific behaviors. And you could see a gap. And we'll talk about the gap in a second. However, when they ran it again and they asked very specific, much more specific questions that were actually more directly mapped to behaviors, you saw the gap shrink. So it really mattered how you asked those questions, right? The more specific the question, the more it directly mapped onto actual behaviors that they were taking. So part of this gap that we're finding when people are heterogeneous is that they don't necessarily, when you ask someone, do you trust the government? You all thought of different agencies within the government, right? So I might have thought of tax. Someone else might have thought of the Department of Justice. Someone else might have thought of labor, right? And you trust them in very different ways. And so when we ask these general questions, do you care about security online? You all think about different things. I might think of my credit card and someone else thinks about a VPN, right? So that's why these general statements are helpful. They give you direction, but it's important to ask very specific questions as well. And so what we're gathering when we say people have heterogeneous privacy concerns is not that they actually have heterogeneous privacy concerns. They just answer those survey questions differently. And we don't usually hold that against them, right? We don't say that anything goes at that point. Okay. So finally, the great privacy paradox, and I'm going to give you an example of the crypto pizza study that I love so much. So the privacy paradox is kind of I always jokingly call it the throwaway line, which is when you actually do a survey that looks great, and is actually capturing specific privacy preferences, and the people say, I don't like what firms are doing with my data, then on the other side, the firms will be like, yes, but there's this other thing that we have in our hip pocket, it's called the privacy paradox. And what that says is that people regularly might say that they care about privacy, but they continue to do fill in the blank. So a standard one might be, people say they care about privacy, but they continue to use Amazon online, therefore, they don't actually care about privacy. So you might say those two have nothing to do with each other, and I would agree with you, but yet it kind of goes back to the consumer problem. And so what does this say? Do you care about privacy? It's when we're looking for a disconnect between what people say in a survey and how they act. The action, they still go online, they still share information, again, the concealment issue, and then we would say that there's some sort of a paradox. So you see the privacy paradox statement all the time. It's constant, like a lot. So I just have pages of it. This is one of and I would not pick on this, except it comes up on the other side of cases that I'm on all the time. It's kind of a standard one that we use. And it's this, I call it the crypto pizza study. And this is a study that showed, and they cite it all the time, even though it's not published. It's just, the survey asked students back in the day to rate wallets, crypto wallets, in terms of their traceability by peers, wallet service providers, and the government. Meaning, who do you want to be able to see what activity is in your crypto wallet, if you had a crypto wallet? And so they got the answers to these questions. They then normalized the data and put people into categories of I care about privacy versus I don't care as much about privacy. So just generally within the student population, are you high or low for privacy, right? And so it's just, and actually the questions were only about crypto wallets. Then at the end of this survey and this research study, the researchers went up to the students and said, hey, would you guys like free pizza? And then they said, yes. It's not surprising. They said yes. And they said, great, just give me your email address and the email address of a couple friends and we'll give you coupons for free pizza. And so lo and behold, the students actually would then give email addresses for both them and their friends to get free pizza. And when the students were rated high for privacy concerns on the crypto wallet and yet still gave out email addresses to researchers for pizza, the researchers said, paradox. So this is the whole basis of this is why there's this sort of a privacy paradox. And we can actually show that you might say that you care about privacy, which is operationalized by how you answer questions about a crypto wallet, but you're going to still act in a way that we find to be privacy violating, which is you gave us researchers email addresses for your pizza. And you're probably thinking to yourself, how could I be a Stanford economist and do that kind of study? Which would be totally fair for you to say, because that's a crazy study. And whenever I describe it, people are like, that doesn't exist. And I'm like, it does exist. And again, and so this is the summary. This is a quote from the paper. Whereas people say they care about privacy, they are willing to relinquish private data quite easily when incentivized to do so. So that's an amazing statement to make over that study, right? Like we normally, if you have a PhD advisor, named Martin or Craner, that they would say you cannot make that statement based on that data. Like you can say something about very specific things about what people are willing to give researchers, but you can't make this particular statement. So, but this is the type of generalization that we see happening because people so badly want to say that there's a paradox. So we see this just generally with these more specific questions. Does the survey actually, the questions that I would suggest we need to start asking are, does the survey actually measure privacy expectations? Does the question include the context, the use, the type of data, who's getting the data? Like, are you actually measuring what people want in that specific instance? Because you can generalize from it at that point. Then the second question would be, does the action actually measure a privacy preference? Is there an actual choice there? Is it measuring just disclosure of email addresses to a researcher that has IRB approval in a university setting? That's a very different situation than posting pictures of your friends online, which perhaps is a privacy violation, because then you might have asked them and said, can I post this picture of you? And they said no, right? So there's very different things. And then the final thing I'd say is the action at all related to the question? So which seems like 101 for a study, but you have to make sure that they actually are the same thing, right? Okay, so actions is revealed preferences. And so actions can be revealed preferences, right? So you can create user interfaces that are trying to better capture whether or not people want their privacy, like actually are having their data being used in the appropriate way of what they want. So a good example is some of the anti-tracking like interfaces where you have to opt in. There's many ways that we've tried to make things better, especially at Carnegie Mellon, I always say, to make things better around this issue of both better notification and creating better choices so that market actions are a good revelation or a good operationalization of whether or not people have their privacy respected. But whether or not we gave email addresses to someone is actually not one of them, right? So the goal should be that we try to understand how actions can better reflect what they want, measuring what they want in a way that's meaningful, and then also trying to have interfaces so it allows them to operationalize what they want online. So privacy actions do not suddenly equal general dispositions. That's what we see in the world. So we make this assumption that people's actions always illustrate a privacy need. So my privacy need is always being reflected in my action. And that, I would just say, putting on an economist hat, that is the ideal world where your actions are always a perfect reflection of your preferences and needs, right? That's a beautiful world that economists, we talk about in this idealized version of events where there's no transaction costs and there's perfect information. And there's no one that thinks that actually exists right now in this space. So if you think that people's actions illustrate their privacy needs, then we would say we can actually disregard the surveys that we find because the actions that they show, we continue to use Google search, we continue to use Meta, we continue to use fill in the blank. Therefore, people's privacy preferences are being met because if we didn't think our privacy preferences were being met, we'd stop using the service. That's what they're arguing. If, however, we think, and then we also like to blame the respondent because that's always a good thing, is one of the oddest things in the world is that in this field only, when we measure something in a survey and then ask if we can see if you can actually, does the person do it online, when they don't. So when all of a sudden we ask a question in a survey and then find out if they took action that's reflective of that question, or the survey question, we normally, in a normal world, you would say my question was wrong. So I didn't measure the question. My question was wrong. So if I'm measuring something around trust in your leadership, or whether you want to buy a certain car of a certain color, and you said you wanted a red car, and then you went out and there was a red car and a blue car, and you picked the blue car, I think I must not have gotten the right market data, because you told me that you only wanted a red car, but you just superseded that. I need to understand how to better ask that question, right? That's normally in science what we would ask. No, not in privacy. In privacy, what we do is we say our question was perfect. You guys are just idiots, and you just are choosing the wrong thing in the market, right? Like, or that you just answered the question wrong. We don't take ownership of the fact that we asked the wrong question. Not all of us. I take that back. I would point to Lori and Alessandro's paper where they actually started asking different questions, right? Like, so it's to better understand how to ask those questions. And so part of this is just using normal science methods to better understand how to ask those questions. If, however, you don't think people's actions illustrate privacy needs, then courts and regulators should really focus on why people aren't able to actualize their preferences in the market. So we're just assuming that they do, but let's just say they are. So, for example, I'll just take a hypothetical one. Let's say that people don't want their search results to be stored for very long at all. And that we know actually by surveys that they want it to be stored by less than 1 month, especially to be used for advertising. So we're okay with search results being stored for immediate search results and for advertising on the search page, but we ask surveys questions all the time. Let's say a company asks it as well, and that they know that it's not wanted. But they never give you that choice, right? So they don't ever give you that option. They say that your default is 3 years. And if you don't like 3 years, you could possibly take it down to 1.5 or 1 year. That's the lowest we're going to allow it to be not stored after that point in time. So a good regulator would then go in and say, well, I'm not going to assume that that's actually what the people wanted, because I've asked them survey questions, very specific ones, and they've said 1 month. They only want 1 month. And so then as a regulator, you go in and say, why aren't you? What about the market is structured so that you don't have to actually meet their privacy needs? Are you not informing them? Are they not able to find the choice? Do you have no competitors, right? These are very different questions to start asking versus I'm just going to assume that the market is working perfectly and that people are able to actualize what they want in the marketplace. So a very different set of questions. And this is why I think it is a good way of explaining or showing why the way we talk about studies makes a big difference to how regulators think about regulating these companies. We think of these titles as just kind of giveaways, or the abstracts is just something that we don't need to worry about. But these surveys and these generalizations are actually picked up and used. That crypto pizza study is used in court, like on the firm side, right? It's actually used in court to defend the idea that companies should be able to do whatever they want because people regularly don't act according to the privacy statements that they make in surveys, even though we all can see that that was problematic. Okay. So, this is what is it? This is the one that I like. Is there a reverse privacy paradox? This is the paper where, I forgot about Jessica, so I apologize to Jessica everywhere, but I was calling it the Lori and Alessandro paper. So this is the paper where they actually ran different sets of questions, and as they asked more specific questions that were more tied to the behavior they were trying to measure, you could see as they got closer and closer to actually predicting whether or not someone would actually do that behavior. A great point of how asking the questions in a different way matters. So, and by the way, I did not add that just because I was coming to give this talk. I actually had given this talk in many places, and I just constantly talking about Carnegie Mellon, even before I was here. So implications for law and public policy. So in sum, this is just to kind of say what we talked about. When we talk about the privacy trade-off, and we talk about this unconcerned consumer, and we talk about the privacy paradox, that actually has real implications to policy. I guess that's what I was trying to put through, is it has implications because when newspapers talk about it, when regulators talk about it, they are picking up these studies. They're talking about these studies, they actually use the findings, and they're using them actually in the cases or to justify not regulating. So it's important how we talk about these things. And I would just say that there's a number of places where we're actually talking about these things right now. I talked about in the beginning. You have the cases against Google, you have cases against Apple, so they're bringing antitrust cases. FTC is doing an Unfair Practices Act, or they were, we'll see if they still do, around data brokers, right? And so the reason why this is important is the FTC used to only go after companies for deception. They have two vehicles, right? Deception, which is just, did you lie in your privacy notice or your security notice and use the data in the wrong way? So that's just a lying factor. What they're now starting to do is say, look, your business as say Kuchava as a data broker, is just inherently unfair. It does no good for consumers and only exploits consumers. So you can see how the government is actually starting to think about the rights of people or the implications or the interests of people in their privacy online. There's class action cases, the FTC disgorgement, which I mentioned, and then you'll have a whole bunch of EU regulations in the principal case. And this is all to say that this idea that privacy is dead is just not how we're currently thinking about it. I think the focus on consumers having autonomy and like being able to choose what they want and actually being able to having heterogeneous privacy concerns, I jokingly say is the death rattle of every industry. So if you look back at the major issues in the United States with regulating industry, you can see that one of the last gasps they make before regulation is claiming consumer autonomy. And a great example of that is seatbelts. So actually, I've been talking to Florian about this case. And so I found this is from, literally, it's about seatbelt use in the United States. And it goes up to like 1956. It's by the Department of Transportation. It's literally, obviously, this is like an online version of it. It's from 1949 to 1956. And it was prepared by the Department of Transportation. And the main issue was the industry was absolutely adamant that consumers and they should not have to put in seatbelts. They were fighting seatbelts like crazy. And they argued that you were safer being ejected from the car than the restraint of a seatbelt, because the seatbelt might hurt you and keep you in the car, and maybe the car catches on fire, and then you'd be better off if you were thrown from the car. Second, people asked, well, wait a second, how come you have seatbelts on pilots in the Air Force? And they were like, oh, right, okay, got it. But guess what? Consumers don't want it, because really the whole idea of automobiles is like they literally would talk about how it's almost like being a cowboy, and it was macho, and people wanted danger. And when they asked consumers, do you want a seatbelt, that they said no. And so they were arguing consumer autonomy. They were like, no, let the consumers decide if they want the seatbelt or not, just ignoring the fact that they didn't offer seatbelts, so there was no choice in the marketplace. And they even got to the point where Ford, it's like 10 pages, it's hysterical, because they talk about Ford, who was small at the time, much smaller than GM, offered seatbelts, and the other companies got so mad at them because they were like the big tech. It's hard to imagine this, but the U.S. automakers and steel were like the big tech of back in the day. You know, they were, as the kind of old saying was, like, as GM goes, so does the nation. They were seen as like what we think of now as Meta, Google, and Apple, right? And so I know that seems like mind-blowing that Ford was ever thought of that way. And so Ford actually got ahead and offered seatbelts, and GM got so mad that they all live around each other in Detroit. They would literally pick at each other and bully each other on the playground, like where their kids were all playing, or they would say, look, you're making a bad name for us by getting out ahead of this. We don't want to offer seatbelts, knock it off. And so Ford acquiesced and pulled back and said, okay, we're going to take the seatbelts away. All this is to say is that they were wrong. Okay, so they were completely wrong. And it seems almost comical that they fought this for so long. They argued that they would go out of business if they had to do it, that consumers didn't want it. The main thing is to say that just because companies tell us that it's impossible to do something, or that their industry is going to die if they have to be regulated, or that consumers actually want something that you're thinking, that sounds crazy, I don't think they actually want that, doesn't mean that we stop and believe them. Does that make sense? Like, we have a long history of doing this forever and ever, and we don't have to actually believe what companies say. There's a woman named Deb Johnson who I adore reading, and she has this whole thing about responsibilization, and like not responsibilization, but being responsible and accountable when it comes to technology. And she talks about it as a process. And what I like about it, is that what it means is that it's a process. You argue that someone's responsible for someone. They say, no, I'm not. But that's not the end of it. It's a process. So it's like a dialectic. And we say, yes, you are. And this is why. And so right now we're kind of stuck with the no, I'm not. You know, every child says that at first. No, I'm not responsible for that. And then we're supposed to say, yes, you are. And so the seatbelt example is just to say that this is a long time coming within the United States. So, but I totally appreciate you taking the time to talk about this. It's really a pleasure. It was like 10, 11 years ago last year talking about privacy, so I appreciate the opportunity to come back and do it again. And I would love any questions that you might have with the talk.